Melbourne. My name is Graham Huon and I'm the chair of the Melbourne section of the AES. Tonight and today, we are very privileged to have Tomlinson Holman for a presentation. Tomlinson Holman is a recognised guru of surround sound. He's a fellow of the AES, holding the AES Silver Medal, holds the IEEE Masara Ibuka Award, and has an Academy Award for Technical Achievement. He's published widely, lectured at the University of Southern California, run Apple at Audio for 8 years, developed equipment and specified the standards used today around the world. We all know THX and 5.1, which were his brainchild. Tonight we're going to hear about the history and future of surround sound. Now there's quite a bit for us to get through tonight, so please hold your questions until the end and take advantage of the Zoom chat so we don't lose any of your questions. I'll be making some announcements at the end about other sessions that we'll be having, and when you hold your questions to the end, Tom will take them. So now, if Tomlinson's there, yes, he is. No, he's not. Yes, he is. I'd like you all now to welcome Tomlinson Holman with the usual online standing ovation, which is usually silent. Okay, so Tomlinson, there's quite a bit to do tonight, and I certainly welcome you to the Melbourne section of the AES.
Thank you, Graham. Good day. Or should I say good night? I'm not quite sure what the Aussie is for that. Anyway, I'm glad to have you. I'm glad to be here, and I'll get started. I'm going to do screen sharing, and I'm going to share this screen, and I'm going to go to this. So hopefully you continue to share. And hopefully you see the history and future of surround sound full frame or nearly full frame in your picture.
Yes.
I've been lucky enough principally through AES to have given this talk all over the place, 5 continents. And next week, State College, PA, they seem to come with increasing frequency. And I've been doing it for many years, so it's in many revisions. I can't even keep track of how many revisions it is. Some of it is the first chapter of my book. I'll plug that at the end. It is a story of death and resurrection in 6 acts. It's an opera. Oops. And here is the overture. We shall see why Flight of the Bumblebee is our overture later on. It is very much related to surround sound. Now, this is available in 5.1, 7.1, etc., but we are limited by Zoom here, so we try to give you a little taste of something over 2 channels, but it is a great compression to play this multi-channel recording in 2 channels. We'll do best we can. So that was the overture, and here's the prologue. We start in 1550 with Adrian Willert in a well-known place, and he was the first that we know of to use a chorus in a left-right orientation for call and answer of antiphonal music. It was at St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. And note those 5 openings in the doors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that will show up in the next slide. It will show up in the next slide. Around 1585, sometime later, Giovanni Gabrieli exploited the unique architecture of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice to create groundbreaking spatial and directional effects in his music. Using a technique known as cori spezzati, he placed multiple choirs of singers and instruments in different lofts throughout the church. Other churches, meanwhile, were affected. A front-back orientation was common because many were long and skinny. Freiburg Cathedral by 1714 had 4 organs, so it had a kind of surround sound effect. Although they were not organized in the square that we think of as quad, nevertheless, they were 4 separated organ chambers, and they were made into a quad LP with E-Power Biggs at the helm. There's one single console going out to 4 sets of organ pipes. And here it is. So that was CBS trying to show off SQ. They kind of cheated a bit and organized those spread around the church into a square quad. So it's not quite fair. I got the LP and I bought the only, or the best at least, new SQ decoder, which is made in Australia, by the way. Other churches were affected at Chartres, Metz, Strasbourg, and others. They often had what was called a swallow's nest organ chamber to hear the tones from God well above. So very far up the side walls are much, much higher. So surround sound starts proliferating through churches. By the 19th century, Symphonie Fantastique in 1830 had directions in the score for an offstage oboe to give it a depth dimension. And 7 years later, in his Requiem, he has 4 orchestras at the 4 compass directions with different orchestrations for each one in the score. I found this in the LA Public Library. So we jump forward to surround recording. So that's the background before it was recorded. It was an extension of Bell Labs' story. Here's a backstory. In 1933, Bell Labs conducted a live transmission of an orchestra from the Academy of Music in Philadelphia to Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. And they provided high bandwidth and dynamic range, equalized telephone lines, and it was a stereophonic effect. They had to study the number of channels that were needed, and someone named Snow did that. And here is his thought experiment. On the stage, there's a source which produces a spatial direct sound pulse picked up by an array of microphones, carried over electrical channels to an array of loudspeakers, which then make a virtual source so that observers get the right, left, rightness, and depth. So that was his thought experiment. But of course, a screen of microphones that approaches the infinite is rather too big. So he did show that it could produce lateralization and depth, roughly through triangulation. And to make it practical, the number was reduced to 3, left, center, right. Very familiar to us in film sound ever since, not so much in the home. The receiving hall's own acoustics created the sound of the orchestra in the hall. It was the surround. And Stokowski, the ultimate crossover conductor, mixed it himself in Washington. It was played back over these Thuras theater loudspeakers, a 2-way reentrant horn woofer and multi-cell tweeter. In those days, they didn't understand there was a timing difference between the bass and the treble in this thing, and that's something of a problem. But they were able to fill Constitution Hall with loud sound from this very efficient set of organs, and by then they had 20 or 30 watt amplifiers, I believe it was. So that was rather a lot of acoustic power. It was done by putting a black scrimcloth in front of the speakers. And first, a soloist came out in Philadelphia, and then the group built up, and more of the orchestra came out. And at the very end, they lifted the scrimcloth to reveal that everyone had been listening to loudspeakers, astonished everybody. Here he is, Stokowski, at the console in Washington, D.C. Now there's a kind of accident, a roll of the dice. Walt Disney attended a Hollywood Bowl concert of popular classical music conducted by Stokowski in 1936 and had a chance meeting at Chasen's, a Hollywood hangout. I got to go there before it closed, and there were booths, and they had thick velvet curtains and a back door. So famous people could sneak in and get into the booth and get covered up. Nobody knew they were there. However, and Stokowski was having an affair with Greta Garbo when he met Walt Disney. It's likely that Disney prevailed upon a waiter with maybe a little cash, we don't know that for sure, to meet Stokowski. But Stokowski was delighted actually to meet Disney because Disney was a big popular character. He explained to Stokowski that he wanted to bring classical music to the masses. So he was very glad to meet the ultimate conductor. And Stokowski told him of his earlier experience a few years earlier with Bell Lab stereophony. And he said, well, I'll do it for free if you just do it in stereo. Well, that was pretty easy. So Walt Disney is in the studios is in financial trouble and needed a hit. The Depression was still on, and he was sitting in his living room in Toluca Lake when he thinks up adding surrounds to the fronts. It was Flight of the Bumblebee that was the reason for surround sound, because he thought that as soon as the bumblebee flew around the room off the screen, you should hear it do that too. So a well-known person is the inventor of recorded surround sound. The bumblebee should be heard all around you. But ironically, Flight of the Bumblebee is not in the movie because it got cut. So the inspiration didn't quite work for that, but that's all right. It did do the inspiration. Fantasound was rather amazing for its year. It had wide frequency and dynamic ranges. It did that by using only the 40 dB of the dynamic range of optical soundtracks, but it multiplied that with a thing called TOGAD, which was there was a fourth tone channel that mimicked the motions of the mixer. So when it got loud, they turned it up. When it got soft, they turned it down. It's not companding as we think of as Dolby A or something, but it's kind of a manual companding. Loud, turn it up, soft, turn it down. It gave nearly an 80 dB dynamic range in the cinema, which was astonishing. So put the playback levels under control of the mixer. Here's a track like that and three of them. And on the left is the various tones that are used. Multiple oscillators are recorded at different frequencies and then selectively picked out to control VCAs to run the levels of the channels. They did steer 3 channels on the film out to 5 using edge notches and cues to the projectionist with a micro switch to say beep, so pan it please. And it put a small company working out of a garage in Silicon Valley to make the oscillators, and that was Hewlett-Packard started. The first order of any significance was selling oscillators to Disney. Here's the first pan pot. They had to invent that. They had to figure out the law or control function from one to the other. And they figured out in a reverberant stage that a sine cosine law was best, 3 dB down at the crossing point, which is true because it keeps the power constant. So as you pan, it moved well among the channels. They invented the click track, so that they could overdub. And they used distributed surround loudspeakers. They used 65 of these beasts in the Carthay Circle theater in Hollywood that's been torn down. But look at that monster. It's as tall as a person. And it's a two-way horn-loaded system. Because the power sizes were small, we still needed horn loading to get enough level. And they said, we must take large steps forward rather than small ones if we are to inveigle the public away from softball games, bowling alleys, night spots, or rapidly improving radio reproduction. The engineer said that. I love that engineers are using vocabulary like inveigle. How good for them. People were educated in those days. So the conclusions are, here is the rack of equipment. It took 11 racks. It took 15,000 pounds of equipment in 45 shipping cases. It cost $85,000 in in 1939 dollars per screen, and there were only 13 screens in the U.S. that could play it. So it had poor box office in the initial release. It was very expensive to put on because you needed multiple projectionists. It finally broke even and went positive by 1969. It took that long. Thus ends the first act of our drama with the first little death of surround sound. In the second act, surround is revived in order to meet competition. Television, a pre-war invention, burst onto the scene post-war from pent-up demand. The top is the dollar volume, and the bottom is the number of seats of attendance. And you can see it fell after World War II. It fell in the Depression somewhat, but it came back because it put on movies people liked, MGM musicals, and it hit over $16,000 billion in inflation-adjusted dollars. And today we're only at 8-something billion, and that we're in 98. It hasn't changed very much. And so if you calculate it out, the population went to the movies 30 times a year before television because they had to. That was the only entertainment. It's a lot of entertainment. But film struck back, first with Cinerama. Cinerama was invented as a set of training videos, or, well, we'd call them videos today, training films with 3 projectors, and it was guys coming at you, and the machine gunner had to shoot them down. And they must have had a light come out of it and score them somehow. I don't know how. But it used 3 cameras and 3 projectors on this deeply curved screen at Grumman Aircraft on Long Island. And Fred Waller and Hazard Reeves turned that, beating swords into plowshares, into the popular This Is Cinerama in 1952. It needed 5 screen channels because the screens were very big and there was no EQ in those days. So the timbre changed dramatically if you tried to do it with fewer and use phantoms in between them. So they determined they should use 5 because of the mismatching of responses. They used 7-track separate magnetic running on a dubber, and that's a dummy. That's a device that just playback only sprocketed magnetic film. The surrounds were switchable by the projectionist according to cues between a left-right orientation or a front-back orientation. So therefore, kind of showing up some of the later systems. It anticipates what we can do today. Here is Aida being filmed at La Scala. It was in a travelogue format. Probably the most famous scene is the roller coaster scene, and that's copied in Indy 2 by Spielberg. You could see that with rolling through it. But I think this is more fantastic. There's a cast of a zillion on the stage and people all dressed in perfectly. And this is only a few years after the war. Poverty was very high in Italy, but here everyone came out in their finest to do an Aida. It did use a multi-channel microphone rig with 5 microphones, gigantic boom, and it ran a long, long time in New York and a few others. But it ultimately failed due to its costs, triple projectors and SEP-MAG. technical difficulties of double system. You could see the difference between the two if the films weren't exactly matched. They invented a kind of a pinking shears shaker for in between the two, so it kind of smeared them out. How clever that was. And I got to see How the West Was Won many years later, and that's kind of a progression from the East to the West. And it climaxed in the LA five-level freeway, which is a joke to everybody in LA today because it's usually crammed, but there it's shown wide open. It's quite funny. And what a way to end a movie. But that was pretty impractical. However, this gentleman, Henri Chrétien, professor, in France invented the squeeze lens, where you squeeze the image horizontally by 2 to 1, and then on the projector, unsqueeze it back, therefore get a wider projector by 2 to 1. Naturally, by the way, he was so prominent as an astronomer that he had some technology flying on the Hubble Space Telescope. He lasted a long time, and the cinemascope was only one thing he did. Naturally, the wider screen wanted wider sound, so they developed it a little bit over time. It took a little while to turn into 4-track mag on the print, so you didn't have to run the sub mag. Frequency response was pretty decent, and the signal to noise ratio was okay, but the high frequency hiss was covered by an Academy filter that rolled off the high frequencies. And so the LCR and the effects, it was called the effects channel. It wasn't called the surround channel quite yet. But high laboratory costs limited the available prints. The costs were high for the theater to install it because they had to add speakers and widen the screen and do all this other stuff. It was pretty big in 1953, but it saw decreasing use over time. Along comes some others in inventing Todd A.O. for Oklahoma in 1955. This is 70 millimeter now, 6-track magnetic sound on the print, developed to compete with Cinerama by the same guys who had worked on Cinerama. The Michael Todd Sr. did the famous scene of the roller coaster, but went on to compete with it to do this. It had 5 screen channels and 1 effects channel. So there's 6 tracks running 22.5 inches per second. So it gave pretty good quality, albeit it was noisy and hissy. So that was overcome with a high frequency filter. And scanning that quickly and having the head face only so big meant that the very low frequencies got eliminated. So below 50, it increasingly was worse, so it went down. There were, however, left, center, right, and effects channels, which we'll see somewhat later by some systems. It was still the effects. Michael Todd demanded a royalty for every performance, a license fee. But those who copied it didn't require that, and he didn't have an exclusive on 70 millimeter, so that was not good. It kind of cross-faded to Panavision as time went by. And Michael Todd, going to accept an award, died in a plane crash in the New Mexico mountains from icing on the wings in 1958. He was one of Elizabeth Taylor's husbands, the one she really loved, and that was a disaster for her. She wound up owning the Todd A.O. company and the residue of that. Thus, Act 2 ends with our heroes dead or on life support. The equipment was abandoned in place in hundreds of cinemas. So it was revitalized a few times for road shows like Lawrence of Arabia in 2001, in 62 and 68, kept it barely alive. In Act 3, stereo comes home. Then, our attention shifts from the shrinking theater market to home audio. It started in 1950s as a hot market. All those Signal Corps guys came home from World War II with some knowledge and formed a cadre around New York City in one street, which had a bunch of different retailers that made bits and pieces. And you could go and put together a mono at that time, 53 sound system. However, as time went by, in 57, there was the stereo LP, then FM, and then quarter-inch open reel tape, compact cassette, and the CD are all two-channel. And so created a market for home stereo. Of course, there is a crowd that thinks that stereo is not as good as mono because you spend half as much on everything, so it couldn't be as good. But it wildly oversold mono because it was a really good sensation. Very, very useful. However, had a limitation. Three-channel stereo had a hard center, so you could wander about the room and keep it in the right place. A phantom center works if you're sitting exactly in the center line and you hear this thing float in front of you. And that's kind of the magic of stereo. It's something that audiophiles love to hear this speakers over to the sides and hear this sound organized between the two. However, if you're able to move your head, then it kind of falls apart because it wheels around. Not so good. But it was necessary probably to get two speakers in the living room. Honey, can I have another speaker? No, that wouldn't have flown for a third one. Within a few years of stereo, quad came on the scene, but it was too early. Stereo had barely been digested, and it suffered from several problems. The most commonly cited one is competing delivery formats, tape versus records, discrete versus matrix on records, QSSQ and CD4. But that isn't the only problem. There were unclear producing plans, the ones that wanted a natural perspective and others that wanted the center of the band perspective. We got the Consumer Electronics Association to do a survey when which they do monthly, and we put a couple of questions in it. And one of the questions was, do you want to sit in the center of the band or the best seat in the house? Best seat in the house won by like 75%. But most of the producers wanted something new and exciting, so they put the tambourine in the surrounds. When later they did analysis of people listening to stereo, mostly urban people, in one of those mirror, see through the mirror to some people are saying, in particular, urban women were completely frightened by surround sound because there was stuff coming from the surrounds that they did not want. So it did not do well in those kind of experiments. There was also a poor understanding of psychoacoustics. The square array turns out to be suboptimal, shown by the BBC when they got around to it in 74. And the results are here. You can spend quite a lot of time studying this. The concentric rings are the differences in levels between the pairs of channels. And I believe they are on 10, 20, 30 dB, 10 dB difference. So if you produce sound from left and right, you get a phantom image in front of you. And by the way, you also get a phantom image behind you. However, unlike some people stood up at an AES and said, well, I don't understand what's wrong with the deal is with quad. We've got stereo here, and stereo there, and stereo there. Well, you only have two ears, and they are on the sides of your head. You don't have four. So that kind of screws up the sides pretty badly. They're biased toward the front, and the little stuff there tells us it's VG, and very G is very jumpy and very diffuse. So, and the bars show this is a small error, this is a huge error. So quad doesn't really work in imaging all around. So quadraphonics died an early death, but it had some interesting leftover parts. The Schreiber amplitude phase matrix patent, Sansui QS and SQ had hardware built for them. So National Semiconductor built chips and then finally Tate built them, were made for quad, but they dried up, the market dried up for them. So A certain company caused its resurrection, in which our hero comes home to stay, and that is Dolby Stereo. It used the Schreiber SQ patent and introduced in 75. It was a huge hit with Star Wars, and it brought surround to the masses for the first time. But Star Wars didn't do it all at once with Matrix technology. It was platformed. That is, it opened in 70 millimeter theaters, and they did it smartly the Wednesday before Memorial Day. So everybody ditched school, lots of people ditched school, went on Wednesday, came back to school, told all their friends about it, and everybody went on the 3-day weekend, using the highest grosses ever for the introduction of Star Wars. And one of the reasons was this platforming. But to go wide in as many theaters, they needed to do it on 35 millimeter with the Matrix technology added to the mono optical soundtrack by taking its 2 bits and turning them into LT and RT. So LT, RT, center is in phase and surround is out of phase. So they did first revitalize 70 millimeter by using Dolby A noise reduction, but not principally for the noise reduction, principally to get rid of the Academy filter so they could get a bandwidth extension. So it's now flat or on a particular described curve out to a higher frequency. They reused the left center and right center channels because those were only present in some theaters, or they were present in theaters, but you didn't really need it with the equalization was applied now to make the pan smoother. So they invented what is called the baby boom channel at the time by Steve Katz doing a demo for Gary Kurtz, the producer of Star Wars at the Academy. And what they saw was a 10 dB headroom improvement in low bass by turning it down on the print by 10 dB and turning it back up in the theater 10 dB. And the idea is the equal loudness contours of hearing go up in the bass. The clipping of a CD, say, is flat. And that's a problem because you like more bass. So putting in an extra low frequency channel, which is hard to hear localization on, is gives you more headroom and more capability for bass. So it was relatively simple and cheap to convert an existing stereo theater to 35 millimeter Dolby Stereo. You just had to buy a box of gear and plug it in the booth. If they already had, say, a 3-channel system left over from the 50s, they just tuned it up. And it was a kind of 1-2 hit that year, 77, because Star Wars came out in May and Close Encounters came out for Christmas. And meanwhile, the multiplex cinema had been rising. The idea of twinning theaters goes back very early, 1909 or something. But Stan Durwood of AMC is credited with building purpose-built multiplexes that allowed you, to be more like television because you could change the channels. That means you could go to a bunch of different movies. So they could put the big grossing movie in the big theater, and they had an obligation to play it, but they could move it down to smaller theaters as its box office went down. So it's really the multiplex cinema is a part of the story. 70 millimeter was expanded a couple of years later for Superman, and eventually months later for Apocalypse Now by making the surround stereo. And what they did was just use the high frequency sections of LCRC for the left surround, right surround, and the low frequency section for the subwoofer and using filters to do that. This is the first format that you might call 5.1, but the name hadn't come up yet. It used 3 front channels, stereo surround, and baby boom. Why baby? I don't know. In 1987, there was a digital sound on film committee. Now we'd like to get sound onto the print and make it digital. And the task was to do that. We determined that it should be 48 kilohertz sampling. So that some people said 96K, but 48K sound only makes it some feet from the screen. Doesn't make much sense in an auditorium. So 48K is easy. 16-bit dynamic range is okay because theaters have background noise, and that gets us to the 105 dB peak sound pressure level of the calibrated 85 reference and 20 dB of headroom. It's 105 per channel. And that gave us a 12 dB SPL noise floor equivalent, way below theater noise levels. So 16 bits is enough. The big debate centered around the number of channels. You had to use lossy bitrate reduction to fit on the print because unfilled, the CD style, no compression wouldn't fit anyway optically. So this is where the competition happened, is in the lossy bitrate reduction. So the number of channels debate started with we should record an LT-RT because it will be totally reliable, like big fat bits. Okay, one person said. Another person said, let's just duplicate LCRS. We've got that now, and it's good enough. But S has a problem. With a mono surround, if you sit exactly in the center and have things very well tuned up, what you hear is the center of the head image, literally like it's on headphones in mono. And if you move like 6 inches, it'll flip to the left because of the precedence effect, or flip to the right. I learned this by being called into the dub stage by the mixers who said, Tom, the surrounds are left heavy. And I'd go and listen. Oh yeah, where he's sitting it is. And where the other guy's sitting, it's right heavy. And in the middle, oh my gosh, look at the mono surround. That was Return of the Jedi. We had mono surround. So that was a problem. We needed more than one surround channel. Another person went over the top and said, we need 8, 5 screen channels, a left surround, a right surround, and it's discrete boom channel, 8 channels. Now the bits are getting so small that the system isn't reliable. And I stuck my hand up and I said, 5.1. And everybody said, what the hell is he talking about 0.1? How can you have 0.1 of a channel? And I explained that's left, center, right, left surround, right surround, and an LFE channel. Oops. And I think, hang on. I guess I missed a line in here. Yeah, I did. Okay, well, the idea was that the LFE channel did not require the bandwidth of the other channels. It only required enough to get it up to, say, 120 hertz, 240 hertz sampling. So I said to them, the real number in engineering is 5.005, but we'll use marketing rounding. I wish I had owned the trademark on 5.1 because it's been used so much around the world. And it provided something for the salesman in the store to know and the person's buying not to know. They come in and say, well, what's the 0.1? And he'd say, oi, that's the subwoofer. Well, it's not actually true. With bass management, we take all the channels and send them to the sub, and we send the LFE to the sub. It gets more complicated, more technical, but that's okay. It was well understood because the salesman could point to it and, oh, that's the sub. It came out in 1992. Notice it took a few years to happen with Dolby and SRD. It recorded the sound between the perforations. They had done tests in theaters and found that was a reliable place to put it. It used a 12-to-1 bitrate reduction. In a year later, for Jurassic Park, Terry Beard invented DTS with a CD-ROM follower and only 4-to-1 bitrate reduction. Some people thought in the press that, oh, they're less bitrate reduction, it's got to be better. But in fact, that's not quite the answer because their bitrate reduction scheme was not as fancy as Dolby's. And so, in fact, in a blind A/B, you could get either answer depending exactly on the program material. Sony, being late to the party, had to go somewhere else on the film, and they wanted support for left center and right center because the Sony studios had been using that in the 50s. It was little used. Those LCRC channels were used. A track was the bitrate reduction, and it was outside the perforations on both sides of the film. So here's a piece of 35 millimeter film from the outside in, and the picture's in the left side. There's a picture. Then you see that dot dash. And if you're careful and your aperture plate's wrong, you can see the dot dash being projected. But that's the code for the CD-ROM follower. It was very reliable, of course. Not too much to go wrong. Then there's two tracks that are analog. There's a difference. That's an LT and an RT. And then in between the perforations is the Dolby logo in the middle of their field of bits. I think there are probably more Dolby logos on the planet Earth because they're in every frame of every film ever made. So you have to count that up. Oh my God. So we've got everything on one piece of film. Now, studios did not like this because they had to pay roughly $10,000 for the licensing to each of the three companies. And then they had to pay for the equipment in theaters, et cetera, et cetera. Different chains use different equipment. So to get in digital, you had to have all three of these. So when it comes around to changing over to digital cinema, they said, we're not having any cinema. It's linear PCM, and you guys go take a hike. So they didn't have to pay royalties anymore. Next thing that happens is the whole scheme comes home. 5.1 came into the home with the DVD, launched 1996, but by 2006, 10 years later, it had 81% penetration into homes and 42,000 titles, $90 players, and more than 4 billion discs shipped, 1.5 billion in 2004 alone. It accounted for 60% of studio revenues. So the studios thought of the movie playing in the theater as the trailer for the DVD. They made more money on the DVDs. However, it has shrunk quite a lot because eventually streaming came along and ate its lunch. So each new technology kind of eats the old technologies. And Blu-ray, not as successful as the DVD. Nice to have it better, but not so much. So let's take a look. We've already got it now into theaters, into homes, but let's do some recapitulation, a great music term. We're doing it again by re-examining it. What does this scheme of 5.1 do well, and what does it do poorly? It has frontal imaging, great, but it lacks thing in surround envelopment. The side imaging is poor, as we saw from the BBC, so the surrounds could be better. And let's study this from three directions: that of physical acoustics, that of psychoacoustics, and the desires of composers and others. In the physical acoustics, we start with JVC doing a grand job of going around the world with a 6-microphone intensity probe and measuring concert halls. And here's the Concertgebouw, and the hall is the small rectangle in the middle. The biggest circle is the direct sound, and all the little circles are the reflections. And you can see they're more dense around the front, especially in the horizontal plane, and they get to be less in the back and so forth. I've heard concerts in the Concertgebouw. It's my opinion that it is the best, beats the other two of the top three. And so they went around the world doing this. And they included my screening room at Skywalker. And they said, there aren't any acoustics. And I said, yes, that's on purpose because we have recorded acoustics. Therefore, we can move you from a telephone booth to a gymnasium and have it be recorded on the soundtrack and reproduced on the soundtrack. They were quite surprised by that. So how do we evaluate these acoustics? We do it through psychoacoustics. And one of the most important is the minimum audible angle. And this came up starting around 1958. University of Florida is prominent in it. And here are some results. This is a sphere with little crosses having small loudspeakers. The person is sitting in the middle of the sphere with their head clamped, and the speakers are played I was in a similar chamber, by the way, in Sydney some years ago. And the little short line segments show where the errors occur. So here they're very small. Looking in at the front, looking in toward the nose, you can see, first of all, there's not much error, and the ellipses that show the error are quite small. They are about 1 degree horizontally, so we can hear about 1 degree, and they're about 3 degrees vertically. But see, the circles or ellipses get much bigger toward the sides and towards the back. And here it's all, so the lesson of this is, gee, I'd rather have more channels in front than I have in the surrounds. Doesn't that make sense? From the sides and from the back. So in the re-examination of the history of music, we start with Mozart. He played for the king as a small boy in a small room at Versailles with almost no acoustics. It's on the tour of Versailles, so do that if you can, and do it in March, a rainy morning, because I was in a group of 4 people with this docent, and later in the summer it gets to be 100 people. You'd never see this, but they gave the story of Mozart playing for the king in this small room. By the way, he was so good that they transferred him to the big room with more reverberation to play the organ. Uh, Next is Beethoven. Well, we know that Mozart had limited forces, limited frequency range because of the instruments, and limited dynamic range because of the instruments. Beethoven expands the frequency range and the dynamic range more than anything else. Just saw that Beethoven 9 in Cleveland. And you go on to Mahler and Berlioz later in the Romantic era. And what do? They start spreading things. It's more powerful. Symphony of 1000, it's bigger, not bigger than the ninth, I guess, but it's bigger. And they start with off screen, off stage. It's tell the instructions. You get depth out of these from Mahler and Berlioz. Then comes Terminator 2, where the music can be written such does things like boom, 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 which you couldn't do with the others. And it does front back, it does things all around you. And maybe it's only an example, but film sound can do things much more brilliantly all over the place than non-recorded music. Let's re-examine the center channel. It solves the phantom image because of the law of the first wavefront. It causes a small, sweet line. I'm astonished when I go to CES, to high-end places, and see people sit anywhere relative to the speakers. What? They're not getting a stereo image. You have to sit where it works. Only a couple of models ever solve that problem of moving around. And there's also a crosstalk dip problem. Because the left speaker is heard by both ears and has to wrap around, there's some frequency response difference because of HRTFs wrapping around, and it's about 200 microseconds late. It causes a 2 kilohertz dip. Guess what? That's right in the range where we get some intelligibility. So that's kind of not so good to have that. A back surround. Let's think about the back surround. This was proposed to us over 20 years ago with, we'll show in a minute. Yoichi Ando showed it that adds to envelopment. He studied in an anechoic chamber the number of channels needed, and he came up doing 2, 3, 4, 5, and the minimum number was 5. But the locations were weird. It's left and right surround, and center back creates the most envelopment. This is not an imaging experiment. It's a spacious enveloping experiment. However, rearward imaging of that is a plus. We were asked on Casper, the friendly ghost, when Casper flies from the screen to the surrounds, we only hear him here. I'd like it to go behind. And you can't really, with surrounds array here, you only get that. You can't get it until you get an added channel. And that was added for Casper. 5.1 doesn't work. Width channels, my favorites. Add width channels at plus or minus 60 degrees, where stereo is at plus or minus 30 degrees, because you can capture a location found to be very important in concert hall acoustics. Yoichi Ando once again studied Symphony Hall very well and found the first sidewall reflection. He got the right angle, the right timing, angle, spectrum, etc. off those walls. These add to auditory source width. It adds to envelopment, and it works on imaging all around because you've got more cardinal points. We did a demonstration to show that you can image all around by foreshadowing some of what we did later. The utility of off-screen channels has been found by Hollywood, and I've just heard it a couple of weeks ago, as one battle after another. Go to that in a Dolby Atmos theater with channels, and it's what they've done with the music is great. It's a new thing to go outside the screen with the music and into the surrounds too, but also in particular the width channels were especially good in the Skywalker Stag Theater. So width channels are useful. Height channels, once you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the front and at least 3 in the surrounds, and of course the market actually evolved to put in 4 surrounds rather than 3, but 5 and 4, by then you probably got imaging and envelopment as well as you can do, and you want to raise it off the plane. Now, where's the most important? It's where the first reflections occur in the environment, and where human perception is better. Experiment we showed, not our experiment. So heights in front at plus minus 45 degrees in plan and 45 degrees high help things out. Are we done yet? We've got now 5 across the front, 4 surrounds, and 2 heights. Well, we can still, if we're able to move our head around, we can hear and show the Golden Gate Bridge near where I am. We need some kind of diffuse field as well. In a large room, we use arrays for this. In a small room, we use dipoles, my invention, to stimulate the reverberant room, but not send much information. It's a dipole on edge, so you don't send much at the listener, but spray it around the room. However, if you have a small dead professional space, again, you have to revert to an array. It doesn't work. The dipole doesn't work well. So here is progress. IATU BS 775 is the 5.1 channel international standard, and the 10.2 enhancement adds left and right wide, left and right high, a back surround channel, and we used 2 subs. At the time, it was thought that 2 subs was essential. Now it's kind of debatable whether it is or not, but I wanted it in there in these systems so that you had at least enough headroom to match the other channels. So it was useful for that, if not for imaging, which is another cup of tea. So 10.2 channel sound we developed at my university, USC, was twice as good as 5.1 and was done in 1997. So that's pretty early in how these things go. And the president of DTS said much later, remember when Holman demonstrated 10.2 and we thought he was crazy? And of course, the number of channels has exploded. And so I guess I wasn't so crazy. I was just ahead of my time. So what comes up is the idea of channel-based, 5, 7, 10, and more, versus object-based audio. If you record monaural or 2-channel stereo objects, and then you pan them upon playback with some metadata, you can get better spatial capacity. So 5.1 is the best known channel-oriented audio, but object-oriented audio has tracks that get assigned to output channels on the fly, and there's information in this thesis, which I can send out if people are interested. The most obvious of these is Dolby Atmos. In the cinema, it's different than Dolby Atmos at home. They use the same trade name, not quite fair, but it's channel plus object-based with up to 128 channels and automatically mixed down to auditoriums for backwards compatibility to 5.1 and 7.1. An acquisition they made of IMM Sound of University Research in Barcelona, where they had gotten a number of theaters in Spain and South America, but they had the idea, I'm not sure it was unique, but it was important, that by doing channels and objects, Hollywood could deal with it better. Because if you only gave them objects, then what am I supposed to do with this? Mixers were flummoxed. So it was very clever to do a combination of the two, I think. Today, there are about 8,000 screens in Dolby Atmos. There are other emerging systems with much smaller numbers, DTSX, Barco Aurith 11.1, which is channel-based, Eosono wavefield synthesis. We could spend a while on that, but I don't need to. It's kind of died. NHK did 22.2. If Holman does 10.2, we'll do twice as many, and it's got to be better. There's MPEG-H and there's ambisonics. They don't really see anything in the cinema. I don't think they're terribly successful. Atmos at home is not the same as cinema. It's from 5.1 to 11.1.8 channels, and there's DTSX and Aura 3D, and those are fighting it out for the market in the home, in both in real cinemas, in big cinemas, and in home theaters, and in car audio, and in gaming, and who knows where it will land. So more channels are better, and maybe so are greater sample rates and word lengths. But those are what we engineers call saturating functions. You get enough and you got enough. You can debate how much is enough, okay, but enough is enough. 24-bit, 144 dB dynamic range could blow out your hearing if you use the whole thing. Not allowed by the US Army to expose its recruits to 144 dB. They have to wear hearing protection. So my theory is the industry should move to bigger pipelines and metadata to say what to do with the pipeline. We did a system where you could press a button on a remote control and switch between best seat in the house and center. It turned out to be on Messiah. Sing Along Messiah is very popular, and people are used to doing that. So they come out with their scores. Well, we did that for a opening in a 10.2 channel store, and we made a switch so that you could hear it beautifully like it sounded in Symphony Hall, and then punch a button, and standing around the back were soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And you could go stand in the section and sing along with them. And you had a professional singer singing on pitch in your ear and made everything much better. And you could switch back and forth. Why not? Send all the bits. We have the bandwidth to do it, and switch it. Okay, this idea is far out and requires a lot in the music industry to do. It's not going to happen for a long time, but maybe someday it might. So surround sound has risen and fallen many times, and in latest times is recovering a little bit in music that we didn't cover. We started it, we tried hard, it failed, and then now it's coming back in small numbers. The LP is beating it, by the way. The LP, who wants to go back to that? It made it in home theater, but today that may be a Pyrrhic victory because the home theaters all have been collapsing into flat panel TVs with not 3-inch TV speakers, 1-inch TV speakers. And people are thinking, slap it up on the wall, good enough for you. And it's a lot of work. Even a soundbar is some work, but really the real thing with many speakers is too much work. So it divides into a hobbyist back to the 1950s. It's a hobbyist business, or it's a super high end. The city of people have they have awards for $150,000 system and $250,000 system and $500,000 system, and they ask me, what did you do? And I say, well, the last system I did was $50 million. Skywalker Ranch. Thank you very much. So lives on. The high loudspeaker count And the consequent difficulty of installation leads it to be hobbyist or rare rich people. But again, one of those characters on the floor of the AES once said, I only got 2 ears. Well, okay, why not just feed them? Well, Bell Labs thought about that. And back in 1933, they invented binaural audio with a dummy called Oscar with those microphones near his ear. And they put him in a glass enclosed box, and they had somebody walk around in that box and talk to him. And they had earphones arranged around the outside of the box so people could put them on and hear what he heard. And there was astonishment in 1933 at the Chicago Fair. But they understood that it wasn't all good and lacked some things. Here's the famous Harvey Fletcher of the Fletcher-Munson curves with a dummy head, but it's strapped on the top of his head, and it has a microphone now much better placed, the ear canal at least, and a headphone on him, and he can rotate his head and even tip it and get dynamic cues. So this makes it a lot more, it works much better, particular to get out of head imaging. One of the hardest things is center front, as it turns out. That's the hardest direction. Who knew? Because we're so used to it, we have it in our heads what that's supposed to be. So headphone based it's been a backwater for some 80 years. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is it was not compatible with loudspeaker reproduction. Only a few people sorted that out and did some electronics for it, but that's complicated. It imposed the dummy head's head-related transfer functions, HRTFs, the frequency response for each angle on one's own, or it worked for some people, but it was not universal by any means. And it was static, and we used dynamic cues. So motion capture is the first thing we need to do. And there was an opera house which didn't have room for a giant console in the house. So they remoted the console and put a dummy sitting in one seat with servo motors on it. So it would go like this. And that resolved the out-of-head imaging and so forth. Can you imagine buying the ticket next to this dummy head and having it go? I don't know what that was like, but it did apparently work, and they did do it. Germany, of course. It's possible to do the same thing electronically today. We can sort out what those HRTFs should be at different angles. I had my curves made in the anechoic chamber in Sydney many years ago. So I had a set of those curves. So you could measure the in-ear canal response by putting a probe microphone down your ear canal, avoiding the two-ear canal problem, use your own with a probe mic, and then reproduce it. And various people had done that. Lake Systems did it. David McGrath, you mentioned earlier, from Lake Systems. Smith Research did it. The guys who developed the DTS coding system went back to make their own thing, and they did it at Smith Research. And Sony finally did it. And if you do the in-ear canal response, then you take it off, put headphones on, measure it again, take the difference, and figure out some way to track the difference. A beanie on top of the head were some of them. Then the whole system works. And it does. COVID actually helped. There's one positive benefit to the thing that killed millions of people. Because they couldn't work together in the studio anymore, they had to work at home. So Mike Minkler, who was one of the mixers of Star Wars, found he could mix at home, and he told me this, as does famous mixer George Massenburg. With such a thing, you can mix on headphones at home. However, Michael Jackson said to me on the dub stage, I got to feel it in my soul during the mix of Captain EO for Disneyland. And what he meant was the bass has to thump your chest. And that's really hard to do with headphones. We need a separate box, a sling that goes over your back and thumps your chest so we can get the Michael Jackson effect. Oh, I've been working on this for some 20 years. The IRT in Germany sent me a dummy head, a Neumann, and Stax headphones, and I did some experiments. Can you imagine that big shipment and all that money? That was super nice of them. But while others, like Smith and Lake Systems, proved the efficacy of it, they were clumsy in various ways. So the developments required were to make self-measured HRTFs easy with optical imaging. And the way to do that is take the phone. Oh, of course, the background device chops it out. But here's your phone, and you pass it around your head and record enough pictures and do enough processing. And this is years of work. And you can figure out the HRTFs. So you can do self-measured HRTFs with optical imaging, and it only takes about 3 minutes to pass the phone around your head and get it. That's astonishing. We can track the head with miniature gyros. They're the size of an IC that go inside a headset. And a great deal of work on the hardest location, the center front. And with that, it was introduced as Apple Vision Pro, which I worked on, supervised for some years. About the last 3 years of my career at Apple was working on this with a group of up to 30 engineers. You know, the thing is, you need resources to do this. I was stuck in my living room doing stuff, and imagine what I got when I got Apple resources. What do you need, Tom? And there are those little bubbles on the sides to produce it. Of course, yes, we don't do the low bass. We haven't met the Michael Jackson yet, but otherwise, it's remarkably good, as any number of people have said. The press comments are that it has fantastic sound quality. The spatial audio is astonishingly clear, adds to the experience, and no doubt the implementation of spatial audio is the unsung hero. I was very proud of those. The Achilles heel is the price. I agree. I understand it. It is very expensive. But after all, it was introduced and does show that things are possible. It shows, try the other guys. I'm sorry, they just don't get it. It's always inside the head. I guess I shouldn't rank how bad they are, but the big companies can make horrible mistakes on this. They don't know what they're doing and they have no taste. So it's just the beginning of this, folks. And I understand a new model is underway. I probably won't trade in mine for the new one. It's mostly about processing power, getting a higher processing power in there, but I've got enough for the audio side, and I can happily watch movies in the nursing home. You know, here I am. I actually developed this from the beginning. My theory was I want this for transcontinental flights. That turns out to be rather hard because your frame of reference is changing, and that's the gyro. You know, do you want the orchestra going over there when you're going over there? That turns out to be a tricky problem. But eventually, I will take them on the plane with me, but I'll probably wind up in the nursing home with them at the end of my life, looking at this. They'll come in and say, "What is he doing?" Of course, you can see through these, so you can see what he's doing. And the first chapter of my book is the beginning of this talk, so I'll plug the book, Surround Sound Up and Running. And the credits are I wrote and presented this. However, the trombonist is anonymous because we can't figure out who he was yet. We're looking for him. He came out from New World Symphony in Miami to the Spielberg scoring stage at USC and played that good performance of it. And Chris Kyriakakis edited and mixed it. So good night.
Well, Tom, there's a lot in that, a lot in that. Thank you very much for that. I now throw it open to questions. If you have questions, can you alert us in the chat session and we'll try and handle them. To kick off, I was just wondering, Tom, do you see a lot more incremental improvements in surround sound, or do you think there could be a revolutionary jump in audio in the future?
Well, it's gotten rather clumsy. The flat panel revolution has kind of killed the home theater. Receiver sales are down. The high end retreats into the high end by making ever more expensive stuff. Some of that because they're very small companies without resources. Some of them are not so good, although some of them have come along now and are better. The company I worked with, Odyssey Labs, is very widespread. Started in a Denon $6,000 receiver and went out to millions and millions of receivers with a calibrated microphone. The idea was, get a microphone out there, get people's rooms. We did a study of some 32,000 loudspeaker to microphone measurements made in homes. We were able to collect the information from the tuning devices and consolidate that and got 30. So we know what the average curve of 32,000 curves is. It's just astonishing data, and we haven't even probed it all thoroughly yet. So that makes it much more reliable and repeatable. But I don't, these are more evolutionary things than they are. There are some revolutionary steps like Fantasia. It's a revolutionary step, but most of it is evolutionary, I would say. And by, the perfect loudspeaker is one that requires no wiring to it. So you can just slap it up, but it's going to need power. So you got to have power to it. So that sort of screws up the proposition of having many, many loudspeakers in your home. It's gorgeous, and I am very pleased with my system, which is five screen channels, four surround channels, lots of brands, lots of models, because I've collected over the years. I didn't buy one thing. A CD would tell you, got to have the same thing everywhere. Well, it turns out with this wildly mismatched system and Odyssey EQ to do it, it matches. It sounds fine. Not only fine, but I'm listening to content that I worked on the dub stage for, and I know what it sounds like. And I've had two Hollywood mixers in and played their content on it, and they say, yes, that's the content. So I'm very proud of my system. But it took me, there's a long story behind this, but it took a long time, particularly on the picture, to get this right. I did a massive A/B between 70 millimeter IMAX and my home OLED. And at the end of the day, the home OLED beats, except for the size, it beat the quality of the picture of the IMAX, even though the director thinks otherwise. He's stuck on film as a wonderful old me, like stuck on LPs. So anyway, I've been rattling on, but I did that A/B. The audio is just fine. Could not hear the difference between the codecs for audio, by the way. Can't hear it. They're good enough. But you can see the difference from the theater. And my home theater did sound better than the IMAX theater. More lines of dialogue were clear. There was less honk. It actually did sound better.
Well, how would you best use your bit budget in this streaming world now?
Ah, that's a good question. Well, of course, it's something that is ever growing. The things that where they started out were pretty miserable. And luckily, companies like Netflix did have good people. I trained them, and they got up to 5.1 pretty quickly, and so there's a lot of competition. So they like to keep it up. There's Atmos in those schemes and so forth. So they're probably they don't really need to provide what they're providing because not that many homes can probably reproduce it, but they're doing it for competitive reasons. So there is a kind of a chicken and egg, I suppose, there, where it's being seeded by companies like Netflix and goes into the home, and then you get these kind of bad sound bars reproducing it up to something like my system. So somebody's doing something somewhere, but unfortunately, the soundbar is probably not the solution.
Okay, thanks for that. Thank you, Tom. Guillaume Potard has a question. Do you think that there's a future for ambisonics? I know Atmos supports it, but I don't know how much it is used currently.
Well, I think ambisonics, I've worked on listening to it over time. We did demos at 10.2 of systems with the best recorded material at an AES, and we discovered something absolutely anathema to it, which is the dipole surrounds sounded better on the recordings. They were the best recordings, the best lake system decoders, and best setup of speakers we could do in a massive AES demo. And Ambisonics is, it's aimed at one person's middle of the head and it doesn't even account for two ears. So I do not, and now it's the popular thing and among researchers and all that stuff. I just don't get it because they move around and it just falls apart.
Okay. Rob Grant, who's here somewhere, do you think Hollywood producers think that the sound experience in movies should be like the sound experience of VR games? Should it, or is there a difference in the two media?
Uh, that's a good question. One thing is, I'll tell you, we had it's related. Uh, Digital comes out on film, but the trailers are still analog. Suddenly, one day, the trailers go to digital. Now the producers fight among themselves about who can make the loudest trailer. So we had a meeting at USC about this, involving everybody, and there was a box lunch. And out on the lawn was a man sitting having his lunch, crying. And I went over and asked him, "What's wrong?" And he said, "If my trailer isn't the loudest, I'll be fired." So, so that's how bad it got. So we created something called the Trailer Audio Standards Agreement, TASA. And to get the green card rating card from the MPAA, you have to go through this process of being measured and containing it. It's still not, we'd like to contain it more, but done as much as we can with that. So now I'm rambling, but that came to mind when the question came up. So let me respond to the question better. Remind me.
Okay, the question was relating to the difference between media for the sound experience and for
Oh,
VR
VR.
games.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't know. A few of the producers are probably savvy to this. Most of them aren't. Most of them are all about contracts and artists and above the line and below the line and stuff like that. Uh, there may be a younger producer out there who would understand that question and think about it. Problem for VR is, well, first of all, I'm not much involved in gaming because it's all the shoot 'em up stuff just drives me, no interest. Like horror movies, I don't go to horror. I don't like horror movies, so I'm allowed to do that. But so gaming, people have tried to make softer games. USC Cinema has a whole gaming division, and they make stuff that does go out in the field, built for, girls building tea houses. Good for them. I don't know how much those sell, but there are various experiences. Um, whether the sort of biggest end of those things wind up being shoot 'em up games, and then, yeah, there are movies that are based on games. That's true too. I'm rambling a bit here. I just don't know.
It
I
is part of it the immersion whilst moving that the VR worlds and the games need that aren't specific to a forward image in a cinema.
Yeah, that's yes, sure. That's certainly true. Whether you can adapt the title to a different medium and do something different with it. One thought is another tangent thought. Mike Minkler, I told you about, has mixed films recently, and then he goes in and makes the home theater mix. And actually, some studios that begin with D are destroying home theater mixes because they contain them to think they're playing back on TV sets. They are not considering the home theater. and they just do these ugly things to the mixes. And I talked to Skywalker, why did you make that bad mix? And they said, oh, that's the rules of the delivery. They have to do it. They have to contain the mix. Oh my gosh. And it's not the same experience. They're losing something on streaming and discs by doing these limitations. Wouldn't it be nice? Where the right place to put that we did back at ATSC is send all the dynamic range and then tailor it to we talked about the desktop, the kitchen tabletop playing a football game. It had to go from your home theater down to the football game and the television and yet be the same bit stream. And that was managed, but it didn't catch on really as much as it should have.
Okay.
Tailor at the end, send a lot of bits, tailor at the end. So that would apply to VR versus, you'd send a lot of objects and you might render them differently with different metadata in the VR than you did in the cinema.
But you could specify that for various mix types for home
Yeah,
cinemas.
yeah.
I've got a comment here from Kristen who said she was aware of the Michael Jackson effect because she had to hold the plaster walls together at Alexis Park for your 10.2 demonstration. Do you remember that?
I don't remember. I'm not her, but I do. Well, we did it twice. Once was in a very small room, and I think somebody was in the bathtub. I remember something about the equipment in the bathtub of an ordinary hotel room. The second time we did it in 1999, we did this huge demo, and the future of audio, and people laughed at us. We did it in the dark. Herbie Hancock came. It was a fantastic demo. It was seated 40 people maybe. This big sound system. And the future of audio, and it proved to be true. It was multi-channel sound, more channels. 10.2 didn't wind up being it, but it really did drive. I don't know. It put it in people's lexicon. That more channels was better.
That's good. I've got Frank Wang now. Your talk about surround sound. You talk about surround sound, yet many people use a single Bluetooth speaker or a
Oh,
soundbar. How do you incorporate surround sound formats such as 10.2 and the rest into Bluetooth speakers?
oh, no idea. Fortunately, that's not my problem. What I'm doing right now is I'm building Micro Theater 2.0. Micro Theater 1.0 was a desktop system, two speakers generally, mainly, on either side of the monitor, directional, so that sitting half a meter away, almost all the sounds from the speakers. And so it's highly dominant. So by doing tricky scaling things, then I could make it sound like a dub stage. So I went from the dub stage to the home theater to the desktop, and it worked. It was used on Titanic, it was used on Contact, it was used professionally in post production. Got to show it to Steven Spielberg, who liked it, but he asked for the model number was C41, Cinema 41. He asked for C48, Cinema for 8 for review rooms for his people. So I'm building that now. Is if Steven Spielberg tells you to build something, go and do it.
Mm.
It's taken me years. That was all hand tuned with parametric analog EQ, and now of course it's all digital and auto tuned. So that should be fun.
Yeah, thanks. My question is also related to because currently, most of the audio files they are actually encoded in some kind of surround sound format. For instance, we have MPEG-H. Currently, we are also going to have MPEG-I. So to see if there's actually like a more effective decoding to Bluetooth speakers to sort of to generate some of the spatial effects, basically. So yeah, that was mainly
My
what I
uh,
was
my
thinking of.
reaction is
Yeah,
my reaction is kind of mean. It's not my problem, man.
not your problem, right? Yeah,
I don't know if it can be done, and it's
yeah.
sad. It's just sad what is done to things. When I hear Raiders of the Lost Ark
Yeah,
mixed by Bill Varney on my system,
yeah,
I
all right.
know it's right.
Yeah.
So let's try that with Bluetooth. I don't think the Bluetooth coding may be a problem, but it's not the
Mm,
biggest problem. It's
okay.
the standard. By the way, in 1989.
Mm,
Before the fall of the Berlin Wall, a man went into a comparison. They did comparisons of 45 loudspeakers and 40 listeners and 32,000 ABs, coming up with semantic differentials, loud, soft, far, near, uh, boomy, sad, whatever. And then they stuffed it all in a hopper and stirred with the physical measurements of those speakers. And they came up with only two differences. One is the listening window response and the power response or directivity index were the only two things. Phase response didn't matter, distortion didn't matter within limits, etc. So look that paper up. It's in Acoustica, about 1989, published. Forgotten the exact title, but it's just amazing that only before the wall fell in Dresden, Germany, could they do that. And nobody's ever going to do that again. And
Yeah.
so when the Bluetooth speaker can deliver the right frequency range, dynamic range, and spatial capacity, then they'll be solved.
Yeah, thanks.
I think it's somewhere in the 1,200 page specification of the latest Bluetooth. I'm sure it's in there somewhere, but I haven't found it. And any more questions from the group? Rob Grant. In movies, does the Atmos auto down mixing to stereo or headphone mix work? Through headphones, panning of effects like moving vehicles is quite extreme, moving the effect from a total left to right. For example, the impression of going deaf in one ear. Will this issue be resolved? You covered that in part.
Well, I don't really know the solid answer to it either. Yes, it exaggerates. One of the reasons I got into the home theater, why there's THX home theaters, I went to CES and the manufacturers of the LTRT decoders were doing all sorts of crazy things. Like it's that scene in James Bond where he flies the airplane horizontally through the, I don't know which dream, through the, and they had it. The guy said, well, the actual movie theater is bigger. So he started it in the left surround, moved it left, center, right, and took it off to the right surround. That's not right. So Home THX started with the idea of getting that stuff right. The other thing was Arnie Nudell of Infinity gave his press conference, and I got in there for some reason, and he took the footfalls of the walkers in Empire Strikes Back, kaboom, and he turned them up about 10 dB. And we had a big fight about what the director intended versus what you get to do with it and play with it at home. And if you're playing with it at home, that's just anathema to me. So these various systems should do what the content intended, what the producer intended. And maybe that's an answer. At least it's a goal for how it should appear in headphones. And it does pretty generally speaking in the Apple headset. I don't think it does that extreme exaggeration that normal headphones do. Try the Apple headset.
It's a plug.
Yes. Well, there's a lot of life, there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in Skywalker Ranch and Home THX. And I just gave an episode, which is up online now, just up online, of my career. It's an hour-long talk. It's on the Boston Audio Society website.
Yes.
So you can go and look at that. And it parallels this one, and it gives you all the bits of my career and all the stuff I'm up to now. And I put retirement in quotes. And one of the items of retirement was doing these kinds of things. I'm doing this, by the way, later in the week for Pennsylvania State University, which is a great ASA and AES chapters of students. So doing a lot of these.
But you're never going to retire, Tom.
Don't plan to. Then your brain fossilizes.
Something happens.
But I get to watch movies. So I work in the mornings. I watch movies in the afternoon.
That's good. There are no more questions that I can see. So I'd like everybody, if they can, to unmute, and so we can actually show our appreciation to Tom, given that this is not a very good hour for you to be up and about. I really want to thank you on behalf of the group for taking the time and giving us an excellent presentation. over a lot of material in a very short space of time. So well done, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you all. Good day.